This year, there's so much negative media at the moment saying we're in a dire housing market and prices are finally going to drop, but will it? So in this video, we're going to go through a couple of great data points that will help you identify growth suburbs and also 3 tips that are going to help you frame and identify properties and types of properties that are going to set you up for life. Finding the right properties obviously is always a hard thing, and even not finding the right suburbs to buy and invest is challenging, especially in a moving market. So today we've got Jeremy Sheppard from DSR Data and Select Residential that's going to help us out with a couple of tools and even a couple of tips that'll probably help you better understand where to invest. So welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So yeah, I obviously reached out. I saw a big you subscribe to some of your content and some of the stuff that you do, in particular more around sort of long-term growth. So you know, I guess it's probably a question you get asked a lot, but like, how does sort of long-term growth, you know, how does it actually drive prices, and how do you identify that really?
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, I do get asked that question quite a lot because most of the products that we provide are for sort of immediate growth, short term. Where's a good place to buy right now? And so a lot of subscribers of our products will ask, what if I'm after something long term? And long term is actually quite easy because time covers over a multitude of ineptitude. If you make a mistake, so long as you're in the market for long enough, that time will heal those errors. And there are only a handful of things that I have found historically that would dictate superior capital growth over the long term. And part of the problem there is that if you go back just 10 or 15 years, 15 years, there's no data available on auction clearance rates, vacancy rates, yields, all the sort of metrics that we use now in the information age weren't available as little as just 15 years ago. So if your horizon is 20 years, 30 years, there's very little data that we've got to make any claims this will work over the long term. And another problem you've got is that everything changes over the long term. So you might have discovered 30 years ago that one particular metric would work in your favor. Maybe it's some particular demographic that you should target. And that may have worked for the last 30 years, but because everything changes, it might not work for the next 30. And so my preference is aim for the next 3 years. And then if things don't quite work out, well, just hang in there. And that seems to work out for most people. So the only 3 things that I've discovered which have evidence, historical data to support them, is don't buy a unit. Houses are preferred. Don't buy anything new, and don't buy in a fringe suburb with vacant land nearby. Buy an established property in a built-up area and make that property a house. So it's pretty simple. You actually don't need any of my expertise or any of my data to make those sort of those decisions.
Well, that's it. That shows over. No,
There you go. Yeah.
And I'm assuming, you know, I guess sort of breaking down those points, like starting with, say, don't buy new. Is that because, I guess, like buying a new car, there's like a certain premium with new products? Is it like a kind of concentration thing? Like, is there anything sort of beyond any other sort of insights you've got from the data?
I think the car is a good analogy. It is depreciation. So you've just forked out a large amount of money for a property which has a quality which I'll call newness. It is new, and people do like new, and that's the very reason why you should avoid them, because in 5 years' time your property isn't new, and in 10 years it's even less new, and in 15 years. So as an example, let's say you were to buy a house and land package. You buy a $200,000 block of land, and just to make the numbers easy, you plonk a $400,000 property, a McMansion on that block of land. So you've got a $600,000 investment, and only a third of it is land. Now, it's the land that appreciates whilst the building depreciates. So let's fast track 10 years and we'll say the land has doubled in value. That $200,000 block of land is now worth $400,000, but the dwelling has depreciated. It was worth 400,000. Let's say now it's only worth 300,000. So you've got a $300,000 dwelling on a $400,000 block of land. You've got a $700,000 asset. Now that sounds great. It's gone from 600,000 to 700,000, but it took you a decade to get there, and that is that is worse than the national growth rate over the last few decades. Contrast that with, let's turn it around and say you buy a $400,000 block of land and it's an established property. So the dwelling has aged a bit. It's worth $200,000. So it's still a $600,000 investment. And let's assume once again that the dwelling depreciates and the land appreciates. The land doubles in value. So you've gone from a $400,000 block of land to an $800,000 block of land with a dwelling was 200,000. Now let's say it's 150,000. So you've now got a property that's worth 950,000. You bought two properties. One was brand new for 600,000. One was established for 600,000. And both have doubled their land value. They had the same rates of capital appreciation, but one's worth 700,000, the new, and the established is worth 950,000. It's a significant difference. And that's a metric we call the land asset ratio. And you just don't get a high land asset ratio if you buy new property.
And I guess in a similar vein then, with your second point about buying a house, I'm assuming that's probably mostly around the sort of that land ratio, is it? And sort of that's why you recommend that buying house.
Yeah. I mean, all I can do is speculate as to the cause. All I'm doing is looking at here's what history tells us. But I think what you just said hits the nail on the head there. People they look at the glossy brochures, they like all the mod cons, they're prepared to fork out a large amount of money to live in this property or as an investment. And over time, it just doesn't appreciate like an established house would because of that land value. They've spent too much of their money on paying for something that's shiny and new, and that shiny newness just dissipates. If they had targeted something that's a little tired, a little ugly, a little dated, but it's on a good block of land, it's that amazing thing about land. It looks so ordinary on its own, but that's where all the growth comes from. And buyers get distracted by what's plonked on top of that. And in the case of units, it's not even on top of it, it's hovering above it. So there's less potential for capital growth for units.
And I guess you can see as well for the depreciation, again, for the same reason that you mentioned, with units and land and units and houses, and in the house example. So that makes a lot of sense. The other driver that I know you've spoken about before and you sort of look at is sort of buying in a built up sort of pre-existing area, as opposed to say like a new greenfield site. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so supply is the enemy of capital growth. There's this fundamental law of economics, the law of supply and demand. If demand is high and supply is tight, then prices will go up. And that's for any product or service, and real estate is no different. So if you buy in a fringe suburb where there is loads of vacant land nearby, that land could be developed for decades into the future. That additional supply will thwart capital growth potential. If you buy in an established area that's already completely built up, then there can't be that additional supply. Now, I say there can't be. Obviously, you can knock down houses and build units, and that's another reason why you should buy a house, because you're somewhat quarantined from the oversupply. If you've got a house in a suburb that becomes a sea of units. Someone will always want a backyard, maybe to put their dogs in, maybe for their kids to play in. So if more and more developers are buying up houses, knocking them down and building units, then your house becomes more scarce in that area. So even in the circumstance where there is additional supply of dwellings, if you have a dwelling type that is different from what's being supplied, then you're somewhat protected from that. So yeah, house in a built-up area, again, very easy to research. You just switch to satellite imagery on Google Maps, and again, you don't need any of my help.
I think, yeah, some pretty solid tips. So more, I guess, and I guess sort of back to the point you had earlier about sort of time evens things out, and it's something we've spoken about before, where, you know, property, it's not about timing, because, you know, people probably, I'm sure they ask you all the time, is now the right time? Should I buy in this market? Should I wait for things to crash?
It's always the right time to buy.
Yeah. So I guess, you know, as far as time evens things out, looking at the history, is there, like, you know, the cycle, 7-year cycles, that sort of stuff, or is it just a case of, you know, if you're getting to property, you need to be looking at sort of 10 years?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, if you are looking at the right kind of data, you can almost guarantee capital growth over the next few years. And there's never been a case in any of the history of Australian property markets I've looked at where there was no markets worthwhile investing in. There's always somewhere around the country where it's a good place to invest. Right now, there are bad places and good places, and it's been like that all the time. As far as long term is concerned, one thing that I found really fascinating, which very few people are aware of, is that there's a tendency for every property market to eventually grow at the same rate. We all want to buy in the best area, which will deliver the best capital growth over the long term. But what I've noticed is that property markets will have their surges and sloughs, their booms and busts. And although we can look back over, say, 30 or 40 years of historical data and say, here are the property markets that have outperformed over that period of time, the way in which they've got there is quite interesting, because they've had a short period, which might have only been 5 or 10 years, where they have catapulted ahead of every other property market. It's not a constant outperformance over 30 years. And the best way I can explain this is I use this fruit shop analogy of apples and oranges. Let's say 100 years ago, you walk into a fruit shop and there's a crate of apples and a crate of oranges. And let's say the apples were worth 1 cent and the oranges were worth 2 cents. If over the next 100 years, those oranges grew at 8% per annum, while the apples grew at only 4% per annum, then after 100 years, apples would be worth 50 cents each and oranges would be worth $44. You could buy 88 apples for the price of 1 orange. Now picture yourself walking into a fruit shop today and you've got a crate of oranges worth $44 each and a crate of apples worth 50 cents. Long before that absurdly ridiculous price difference ever arose, people would look at oranges and say, well, geez, that's expensive. Surely there's a cheaper alternative. They'd find apples are comparatively affordable. And so that would reduce the demand for oranges, lowering their growth rate, increase the demand for apples, accelerating their growth rate, and so they would keep up. So it just makes sense that over the long term, you can't have property markets outperform. Now, people will contact you and they contact me and they say, oh, Jeremy, I've seen it. There are examples, and there are exceptions. The general rule with lotto is you lose, but there are exceptions. If you follow these general rules of buying a house rather than a unit, you buy established, you buy in a built-up area. If you follow those general rules, then you will outperform. If you go chasing the exception, the lottery win, you could snag a winner, but you're unlikely to. The historical data says that over the long term, there's not much in it. These are the only 3 things that I have found. There may be some other things. There's so many metrics to analyze. It's very, very difficult. Sorry, I went on for a bit of a rave there, Jade. I'm sorry. What was the original question?
No, I think that answered, because I was actually going to sort of lead that into, like, even as far as trying to identify sort of growth areas, like a tool that I've sort of spoken about before, and you know, quite a good one to use is DSR Data. I guess, do you just want to kind of explain the power, or like how this can be useful for helping identify suburbs?
Okay, so first of all, I just want to point out that this data is only good for around about 3 years. That's as far as our forecasts can go. Excuse me. The ability to predict into the future is extremely difficult, and this is sort of a best guess, but it does have some reasonable degree of reliability. So what we do is we look at supply and demand metrics, things like the percentage of stock that's on market, auction clearance rates, how quickly properties are selling, and the demand to supply ratio, the souped up version, which we call the DSR Plus, looks at 17 different metrics, things like ripple effect, neighbour price balancing, the percentage of properties that are selling at auction, percentage of properties that have open inspections, all these sorts of things give us some vague clue to the nature of supply and demand in a property market. So we give each property market around the country a score out of 100, which represents the potential for capital growth. And like I mentioned, it's based on supply and supply and demand tend to balance out within around about 3 years. Now, it could be 5 or 6 years. It could all happen in 18 months or 2 years. And it could not happen at all. There is a failure rate. But this gives us a starting point for identifying property markets which have potential from a numerical perspective for capital growth. It's then up to the buyer to go and investigate and see, well, is this a hot market? What am I seeing on the ground? And this is the website that we provide for property investors to search the Australian property market to try and find those areas that suit their budget, their yield requirements, to get this high capital growth.
Yeah, and even we find with, say, first home buyers potentially using this, you know, if you're concerned about the market and oversupply and things like that, it can be a good one with some of those indicators.
Oh yeah, great safety net. Make sure you're not entering an oversupplied market. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think, Jeremy, that's awesome. I appreciate your time. We'll include the links below for Select Property and even Suburb Growth, another one of your services that you provide that sort of helps home buyers, you know, identify where the markets are going and give them more data, because like you said, it's just not easily available, or the data on some of the real estate websites is pretty generic and not that insightful.
Yeah, and just be cautious of buying in those greenfield estates or buying from a developer. I just think that's probably the thing that most investors, that's the mistake they make. But if you're just a home buyer, you just want a roof over your head at night, it doesn't really matter so much. And like I said, if you can get in early, I've heard an enormous number of stories over the last 2 decades of property investors, and some of the property investment magazines used to interview them, and they'd always ask this one question: what would you do differently if you had your time over? And some would be developers, some would be renovators, some would just be buy and hold, but they would all have the same response to that question: I would start sooner.
Appreciate your time. That's an awesome way to end it. Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jaden. Thank you.
So